Hey everyone, and welcome to today's Explainer. I gotta tell you, I am absolutely thrilled you're joining me because today we are unpacking something truly fascinating. We're looking at a highly unconventional piece of source material from 2012 titled, What Would Keynes Do with the Japanese Economy? Now, to be clear right up front, we're going to analyze this purely as a historical document of its time. It's basically a window into the intense economic anxieties of a very specific moment in Japan's history, and, well, the completely out-of-the-box way one author decided to tackle them. Okay, let's dive right in. So, right off the bat, you're probably asking, why on earth would a religious leader summon the spirit of a macroeconomist? It's a completely unexpected pairing, right? But that is the exact premise we're looking at today. The author Ryuho Okawa, the head of the religious movement Happy Science, published this text as a channeled dialogue with the spirit of the legendary 20th century British economist John Maynard Keynes. Now, we aren't here to debate the spiritual claims themselves. Instead, we're going to explore how this really unique framing device was used to deliver a blistering critique of Japanese economic policy right in the wake of a massive national tragedy. Here is our quick roadmap for today. First, Japan's economic crisis in early 2012. Second, the background of Keynes's spiritual message. Third, the strong sense of crisis toward the BOJ and government. Fourth, religion's duty to discuss economics. And fifth, choices for overcoming national hardship. All right, let's kick things off with Section 1, Japan's economic crisis in early 2012. To really wrap your head around this text, you have to understand the immense, almost suffocating pressure the country was under when it was published. Picture this. In March 2011, the Great East Japan earthquake and tsunami devastated the nation, literally an unprecedented disaster. Then, as we move into late 2011, the country isn't just dealing with the massive task of physical rebuilding, it's suffocating under severe deflation. Prices are continuously dropping, spending totally freezes, and the economy just grinds to a halt. On top of that, you have a historically strong yen, which makes Japanese goods way too expensive to sell abroad, basically crushing exporters. Then we hit early 2012, and instead of aggressively stimulating the economy, the government and the Ministry of Finance began pushing hard for tax hikes. This compounding timeline of disaster, stagnation, and what the author viewed as completely misguided fiscal policy, that is the exact powder keg that sparked the creation of this book. Right in the book's preface, the author lays out this really sharp, unyielding critique. He argues that the Ministry of Finance's push for tax increases completely lacked any sort of vision for economic development. He paints this vivid picture of a populace still reeling, just utterly exhausted by the 3.11 earthquake and the crushing weight of deflation. To push long-term tax hikes onto citizens who are already hurting that much, well, he argues it's like a, quote, devil from hell running away with its tail between his legs. I know, that is some highly emotive language, but it's strategically designed to highlight this profound disconnect he saw between the suffering public and the bureaucrats calling the shots. Which brings us to Section 2, the background of Keynes' spiritual message. Given this massive disconnect and national paralysis we just talked about, how did the author decide to inject his ideas into the public discourse? Well, on January 3rd, 2012, according to the book's prologue, the author claims to have summoned the spirit of John Maynard Keynes. The prologue is really explicit about the context here. The Japanese government and the Bank of Japan were paralyzed by this excessive fear of inflation, and they totally lacked a proper economic growth strategy. The author felt this overwhelming sense of crisis that normal political discourse just wasn't fixing. He needed a heavyweight, a giant of macroeconomics, to forcefully advocate for aggressive economic intervention to navigate the country out of this hardship. Now, to really grasp what's going on in this book, we have to understand its core mechanism, defined in the text as the spiritual message phenomenon. According to the author, this isn't your typical movie scene where a medium falls into a trance and completely loses consciousness. Instead, it's described as a highly enlightened individual, using their own consciousness and language centers to essentially translate the thoughts of a spirit, in this case, Keynes, into Japanese. Again, we're looking at this neutrally, just trying to understand the framework the author chose to present his macroeconomic policy proposals. It's a way to give this economic advice a real sense of transcendent authority. Let's move to Section 3, the strong sense of crisis toward the BOJ and government. So why was Keynes the right spirit for this specific moment in 2012? In the prologue, the author characterizes the Bank of Japan as an obstinate inflation fighter. The text claims that even after 2 decades of deflationary stagnation, the BOJ was overly timid. They were terrified of even a modest 2 to 3% inflation rate and obsessed with protecting the value of the currency rather than growing the economy. In stark contrast, Keynes is framed by the author as representing the economics of emergency. Think about it. Keynes is the ultimate symbol of aggressive, government-led intervention during a crisis. The author is using Keynes to argue that you absolutely cannot fight a catastrophic deflationary recession with cautious, penny-pinching policies. And the author pushes this critique even further. He actually claims to have previously channeled the guardian spirit of the sitting BOJ governor at the time, Masaki Shirakawa. According to this account, the governor's spirit dismissed Keynesian economics as useless and refused to manipulate the money supply to stimulate the economy. The author interprets this as a tragic lack of courage and vision. He basically accuses the central bank leadership of wanting to just sit comfortably in their chairs and do nothing, completely refusing to take responsibility for saving the nation's economy. Which leads directly to this really powerful philosophical argument from the text. Hayek is free market economics, Keynes is economics of emergency. The author makes the point that economists like Friedrich Hayek, with their non-interventionist free market theories, might be perfectly fine during normal, stable times. But 2012 Japan was absolutely not normal. It was a nation in ruins. The text argues that clinging to strict free market non-interventionism during an active national emergency is just a recipe for disaster. For the author, that made Keynes the essential philosophical guide for the moment.
All right, moving right along into Section 4, Religion's Duty to Discuss Economics.
Now, you might be wondering, why is a religious organization putting out books on central bank policy in the first place? Well, the ideological core of the entire book rests on this one belief. It is our duty to present a choice where citizens do not become unhappy. The author fully anticipates getting criticized for intervening in politics and economics, but he frames economic policy not just as math or bureaucracy, he frames it as a profound moral issue. If bad economic policy, like pushing ill-timed tax hikes during a fragile recovery, causes mass suffering, poverty, and despair, then the author argues it is the strict duty of religion to step in. For him, offering concrete macroeconomic guidelines to overcome the deflationary recession and the earthquake disaster is literally the highest form of spiritual salvation in the modern world. To defend this position against domestic critics, the author actually looks across the Pacific in the book's afterword. He points out that while the U.S. Constitution mandates a separation of church and state, it definitely does not silence believers. He even highlights Mitt Romney, a devout Mormon who was a major presidential candidate back in 2012, to argue that in advanced democracies, believers have every right, and honestly the obligation, to engage deeply in political and economic discourse. The really fascinating takeaway here is this total reversal of how we often view the separation of church and state. The author argues that faith shouldn't be a reason to stay out of politics. Instead, faith acts as our breakwater, a protective barrier that actually empowers citizens to freely discuss and fiercely criticize government actions without fear. In his view, faith guarantees the freedom of speech necessary to hold institutions like the Ministry of Finance and the Bank of Japan accountable. And that brings us to our final section, Section 5, Choices for Overcoming National Hardship. So, what were the actual economic policies this Keynesian spirit proposed to overcome this hardship? The text offers a sweeping macroeconomic overhaul. The alleged spirit advocates for massive disaster recovery spending funded by government bonds, not tax hikes. It calls for completely rethinking the social security system to avoid bankrupting the state. It suggests radically reframing the brutally strong yen not as a curse, but as a boost to buying power. It strongly advocates for joining the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, to boost free trade. And it pushes for massive national infrastructure development, likening it to building a modern Great Wall of disaster preparedness. These chapters directly target the specific, paralyzing fears of 2012. Take the strong yen, for example. Instead of panicking, the text argues that Japan should use the strong currency to import resources cheaply, buy foreign assets, and basically act like a mature, confident creditor nation. By putting these arguments into the mouth of Keynes, the author is trying to shock the Japanese public and policymakers out of their deflationary pessimism. He's offering a highly expansionary, optimistic way out of the crisis. And that wraps up our explainer for today. We've seen how a religious movement used the alleged spirit of a 20th century economist to wage this massive rhetorical war against Japan's central bank and fiscal policies in 2012. It really leaves us with a compelling question. Where exactly do we draw the line between faith, the state, and economic policy when a nation is facing an existential crisis? It's a fascinating look at how economic anxiety can manifest in highly unconventional ways. Thank you so much for exploring this with me today, and as always, keep questioning the world around you.